Hello, welcome to a short and probably inadequate video lecture on the English of modern Britain, Ireland, and the British Commonwealth. This photograph that you see here in this slide is a good, it has a lot of the things that make up what distinguishes high modernity. We have motor cars, we have advertisement, we have great masses of people and urbanization. All of this is characteristic of the 20th century, of really in many ways our own era has only been an expansion of this technologization and intensification and urbanization of society in general. So I'm going to talk briefly in this video about some of the processes that have shaped changes in the English language in the last century, century and a half. And some of these apply both to the North American and to the British context, but many of them happened sooner and more intensely in Britain than in the United States, because it's important to remember that it was only about a century ago, or a little over a century ago, that the United States' economy overtook that of Britain's and became bigger. And it was only in the last, in the interwar years that and especially after the Second World War, that the United States took over from Great Britain as the hegemonic power in the democratic world or the world more generally. So some of the big processes that changed during this time were, of course, the emergence of democracy and social change, which influenced manners and customs and how people speak to each other and how people judge various dialects and class speech. The technology and science has changed, and obviously that's sort of one of the more obvious sources of change in a language, because we have to have words for all kinds of new things. If you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, there's a million words or more, but like 90% of them are technical and scientific words that are not used outside of specialized academic, engineering, science work. I mean, the average number of words that are used in English is somewhere between that are used with any regularity is about 150,000. It's still a lot. That's still a big language with a lot of words for the same things, but it's not like we're using a million words. And in fact, the vocabulary of an average person is generally only somewhere between like 2,000 and 3,000 words, I think. Shakespeare in his whole corpus uses a little over 6,000, and that's exceptionally high. So other factors were, of course, communications technology and transportation, mass media, moving people around, mixing people up so that more people from different regions are interacting with each other. And of course, another factor, interestingly enough, is war, because the great mobilization of World War I and World War II mixed people from all regions together and had them working side by side. And also, war created its own forms of new technology as well that we needed words for. Learned just a few years ago, actually, that the word tank, like as in kind of tank thing, there was originally a code word that they were going to call them like armored mobile artillery transport. They don't like land ships was another word they were going to use. Tank was a code name for it, so that they would talk about it, and if there was like spies or something, they wouldn't imagine what they were talking about. But the name stuck after World War I. So all of these were factors affecting language change. Let's look at them. Democracy and social change. During the 19th century, of course, we had our democratic revolution in the United States in the late 18th century. And of course, it's important to remember that our own democratic revolution has been gradual, right? A good portion of the population of the United States did not have legal citizenship, and in fact was only counted 3/5 in the census in our Constitution. Women couldn't vote in most places until the beginning of the 20th century, 1919, I think. Men without property couldn't vote everywhere for all elections. senators weren't directly elected until the 1890s. They were elected by state legislatures. So America has gotten more democratic over time. And you know, the same thing is true of Great Britain. They had their parliamentary system and they had a constitutional monarchy since the late 1600s, but who had franchise in that government was small, and it spread gradually. There was a big spread in the 19th century, and that really culminated in World War I. Was really a period when the UK becomes much more of a democratic country, though it had been tending that way for a while. All of these wars, the Napoleonic Wars, the World Wars, especially for the UK, the Great War, World War I, were very transformative of society. This is their poster for World War I. There's Lord Kitchener, and this is actually the Uncle Sam poster that's so famous over here. You know, I Want You was based on this one. Anyway, the upshot of all these people moving around, mixing together, traditional old ways of life being disrupted, increased urbanization, is a process that's called Koinezation, which we might refer to as dialect leveling and merging. That is, different kinds of dialects from different regions get smushed, become more similar to each other, and different classes' dialects become more similar to each other. So that by 1950, the accent of an aristocrat and the accent of a worker are closer together than they had been in 1800. By 1950, the accent of somebody from the distant north of England and somebody from the south of England would be closer together, and that process has only accelerated in the last 15 years. So these are a result of enclosures, that is, people being driven off the land because the land is brought into private use. Industrialization, so you have all these people who have been farmers since time immemorial, now going to cities like Manchester and Liverpool and London to work in factories. And again, this is sort of mixing people from all areas together, but they continue to have family back home and going back and forth. We talked about the same thing with the London, Oxford, Cambridge triangle. Also, new communications technologies keep people in touch with each other and bring more people into touch with each other. And another big factor is, of course, and this is true in the United States too, universal public education, which in Britain is mandated by a law in 1870. And so when you have everyone of all classes getting a certain amount of formal schooling and learning how to read and write and learning the standard English, that also has an effect on making the language across the country more uniform. The term Koinezation, interesting, is from the term koine, which was a Greek word meaning common. It was originally the common language of the Greeks from the close of the classical period around 300, 350 BCE to the Byzantine era. But really, we talk about it as being the sort of during the Hellenistic period and the Roman Empire. Greek was a common language in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a language of trade and empire, but it was for a lot of people a second language. And so the Greek that was spoken in the time of, for example, when the New Testament was being written, was simpler, grammatically simpler in terms of less inflected than classical Greece had been. So Koine is the common Greek. It was the Greek that was used commonly by all people. It is in fact the Greek that the kind of Greek that the New Testament is written in. And so we get this idea of Koinezation as a process of different varieties, different regional varieties, class varieties being sort of leveled out and merging together. So Koine was originally this common language of the Greek, and by semantic generalization, it's come to mean a common language shared by various peoples, a lingua franca. Then a lingua franca, the French literally is Latin for French language. And the reason that we use lingua franca to talk about a language that's commonly used by a lot of people for trade and international relations is because French, for centuries in Western Europe, was the language that you had to learn if you wanted to be an international player. France was really the hegemonic power of Western Europe for a long time, with various ups and downs and disruptions. So Koine refers to a colloquial register, though. That is a term that's used by all people, whereas lingua franca is an elite one. So we can talk about English being nowadays, I guess if we were in class right now, I would ask you, is modern English a lingua franca or a Koine? Well, it depends where you are, I think. For some people, like for example, in East Asia and South Asia, English is a lingua franca because it's learned as a second language in order to participate in higher education and international trade and diplomacy. But yeah, okay, so let's talk more about the causes of Koinezation during the 19th and 20th century. It has to do, as I already said, with the circulation of both words and people. Not only is it an effect of public education, but also of cheap newspaper. With the steam press, there's a steam press there. There's a lot more to read. Reading material is a lot more readily available, and so more people are reading, and there's a kind of a snowballing process. And so the printed word and the effects of newsprint and the standard English that's used there has a standardizing effect on the language. Cheap postage means more people are using mail. The mail was this kind of impressive phenomenon in 19th century England. In Sherlock Holmes times, in like the 1880s, 1890s, there were 3 mail deliveries a day in London. This is how much language, how many words, how much mail was being exchanged. Another factor, of course, was the first great breakthrough in telecommunications was the telegraph, where you could only send a signal or a non-signal, and they invented Morse code to turn that into language, but that created the possibility of almost instant communication at a distance. So these are all moving words around, and then you have factors moving people around, the railroad, the steamboat, all of which is creating a greater mobilization of population. We talked already about how in the United States' context, there were more people moving, and this created a greater convergence in the dialect of the United States from an earlier date. Well, this starts later on in Britain, whereas in Britain, in the 1850s, a lot of people were very commonly would be born, live, and die for generations in the same village or the same town or the same neighborhood of their city. And really, it's the industrialization and the invention of modern transportation technology or near modern transportation technology that creates that moving that causes Koinezation. And then in the 20th century, all of these processes are accelerated by more media and more transportation technology, the automobile, and film and broadcasting, radio, so that there is a standard model that you not only read but can hear now, and that people start to use more and more. And technology and science are, however, causes of divergence as well. New discourse domains emerge and grow, new ways and places of using speech. So that this is a driver of vocabulary, but also of specialized discourses where, if somebody, 2 scientists are talking about their research, there's a good chance that you and I are probably not going to understand what they're saying, or like 2 computer programmers, right? So their grammar is standard, but the discourse is so specialized that it sort of breaks away from standard English. And this is driven by innovations in medicine, by the modern research university with its intense specialization, chemistry, physics, biology, etc., information technology, air and space travel. These all have their own idioms, their own sets of language that gets used. This is just a picture of a computer system from the 1960s. I thought it was just kind of cool looking. So in this slideshow, I'm not going to play these for you, but I've given you examples, which I think you might enjoy listening, of the various regional and class varieties of modern British English. This is by no means exhaustive. There is much greater variety and difference in the types of speech that you find in British English than there is in the American English generally. But these are some of the more well-known ones that you might recognize. First of all, an important one in the history of British English is what's called RP, or received pronunciation. This is that upper-class British accent. If you've ever heard Stephen Fry or John Cleese or the Queen talk, this is a very sort of posh kind of, this is actually going out of fashion. You don't hear it spoken so much anymore. It's kind of like we used to have an upper class or a dialect or an acrolect in the United States too. Think of that old sort of, if you've ever watched, what was it, Gilligan's Island, Thurston Howell, that sort of, well, I think. And if you listen to old like radio recordings of Franklin Roosevelt, he had that kind of upper class American accent too. But in RP is being replaced as the sort of standard educated accent by what's sometimes called estuary English. If you've ever heard Ed Sheeran, Jamie Oliver, or the Beckhams talk, this is spoken in Essex and Kent, the intensely populated areas east of London. This is the closest thing to a standard UK English. Attitudes about it vary, and we can say that there's sort of a range between RP, that estuary English kind of occupies a middle ground between the sort of very learned, posh, like let's go to Wimbledon and like wear big hats kind of English, versus Cockney, where you say your THs as Fs and you sound really tough. I'm not even going to do an imitation of it. You can watch the YouTube. It's very funny. But Jason Statham is a good example of a Cockney accent. Or if you're a Doctor Who fan, Rose from the early seasons of the New Who. So those are all kind of in the most populated sort of part of the East Midlands and the Essex and Kent. So this is I won't go as far as to call it mainstream British society, but it's sort of what is all often the center of media, banking, and industry there. There's also the West Country accent. We talked a bit about that in the American one, but that's the one where you pronounce your R's more heavily, and there's various versions of it. But Simon Pegg, if you've ever watched his films, Stephen Merchant, Maisie Williams, who plays Arya Stark, all speak examples of West Country. If you click on these links, you will find examples. And then the real big difference, a real sort of different group of accents, of which there are various kinds, but they share some commonalities, are Northern British accents. And there's a big sort of divide between Northern and Southern British English, which means a lot to them. Or has meant a lot in the past. Just like in the United States, there are over there a set of stereotypes and cultural and social attitudes traditionally attached to accents. That has faded slightly, but the intense degree of feelings that are attached to accents in Great Britain are kind of hard for North Americans to understand. People go to accent coaching to improve their accent, because you're very much pegged in terms of like class and region in a way that some people might strike some people as snobby. In Britain, there are also subculture dialects, which are kind of interesting. In Cockney, there's this old-fashioned rhyming slang. Not really that. I mean, it's not old-fashioned. It's continuously updated and revised with new references. But there's a way of like referring to things by things that rhyme with them rather than the actual word. Again, click on the link and watch the video because it's hilarious and kind of amazingly creative. There's very familiar examples like dog and bone instead of phone, and apples and pears instead of stairs, or some stuff like that. And then you might find this video on Polari interesting, which was a traditional gay argot, a secret language used by various groups, schoolmates, outlaws, colleagues, among many others, to prevent outsiders from understanding their conversation. So, gays and drag queens and various sexual minorities in London from the 19th century through the 20th century spoke this kind of coded language, some of which comes from Romany, or the word you shouldn't use, but gypsy speech. This is a really cool video. I think you might enjoy it. So go into the slideshow and click on that. Very briefly, I have not even begun to exhaust the kinds of English that are spoken in the UK and in the Republic of Ireland. Ireland has three main accent groups, and you can explore this link to learn more about the different kinds of Irish English. Irish English, like American English, is closer to Elizabethan Shakespearean kind of English than standard modern British English is. There's also Scottish English, which we should distinguish between from Scots. So like Robert Burns wrote in the Scots language, which has a distinct vocabulary. It's related to English, but it is not standard English. Scottish English is an accent of standard English, just like U.S. English is. Then there's Welsh English, which, yeah, you can pursue it for yourself. It has a very musical quality to it. And also in Great Britain is Afro-Caribbean English is spoken a lot. There are a great deal of immigrants from former British colonies to Great Britain, such as from Jamaica and Antigua and various other places. And this has influenced the, especially urban dialects of Great Britain. It's also enriched Great Britain's music and culture and life generally, as have the great influxes of former colonial subjects from South Asia. In North America, of course, when we say Asian, we usually mean East Asian, but in Britain it often means South Asian, so Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Nepalese. It's important to remember that the national dish of England is chicken tikka masala, so that's had a huge effect, and it's very common to hear South Asian English, Indian English spoken in Great Britain. I think you learned a bit more. I think we'll learn about that in previous weeks. But this video went a little longer than I thought, but you can watch it on 1.5 speed. Maybe it's late to tell you that now. Maybe I'm already feel like I'm talking 1.5 speed. Anyway, there you go. I really encourage you to click through and explore the videos linked in this slideshow for yourself to really sort of appreciate the rich variety of English that you find in the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. Have a good day.